My son sent me one text at 1:47 inches the morning. 3 words and a location pin. Dad, come now. When I pulled up to the compound gate an hour later, the woman who answered the intercom told me he wasn't there. I said I had his GPS coordinates. She said I was mistaken. Then she said something that turned my blood to ice. Your son is exactly where he needs to be, and he's not going anywhere. I told her I'd be through that gate in 30 seconds whether she opened it or not. She laughed at me. I want you to think about something before I go any further. If your child sent you that text right now, what would you do? I need you to tell me in the comments, because what I did next changed everything. And I'm not sure I'd do a single thing differently. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old, and for the last decade, I've worked as a private investigator specializing in fraud. Before that, I spent 22 years as a federal marshal. I know how institutions protect themselves. I know how power works. And I know what it looks like when someone is hiding something behind a polished surface and a friendly smile. My son, my only child, is 29 years old. His name is Marcus. He's a good man, stubborn, a little idealistic, the kind of person who still believes most people are fundamentally decent. He got that from his mother. Claire passed 8 years ago from an illness that moved faster than any of us could follow. In her last weeks, she made me promise 2 things. One was that I'd stop working so much. I've kept that one imperfectly. The second was that I'd always be there for Marcus, no matter what. That one I've kept, without exception. Marcus met his girlfriend 14 months before that text. Her name was Sienna. Pretty girl. Intense. The kind of person who talked about healing and growth and intentional living. I didn't dislike her, but her family made the back of my neck go tight the first time I met them. Her father, a man named Gerald Voss, ran something called the Clearwater Renewal Center in rural Montana. A residential wellness program, he called it. 42 acres, private cabins, nature immersion, personalized spiritual guidance. The brochure looked like a luxury spa. The testimonials on the website read like religious conversions. I'd looked it up the first week. Marcus mentioned it, out of professional habit. Everything appeared legitimate, licensed, accredited, glowing reviews. But reviews can be bought and licenses can be maintained on paper, while the reality inside is something else entirely. I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own skepticism onto something that was simply outside my experience. Marcus was happy. Sienna seemed to care about him. I backed off. 4 months before the text, Marcus told me he was going to spend 3 weeks at Clearwater. Not as a patient, he said. As a volunteer. Sienna's family needed help with groundskeeping and facility maintenance. He wanted to understand her world better. I asked him if he was sure. He said yes. I asked him to call me every 2 days. He said I was being overprotective. He called me twice in the first week, then once, then not at all. When I reached out, his responses were brief and increasingly strange. He sounded fine, but not like himself. His words were too careful, too measured, like he was reading from something. I called Sienna. She told me the program discouraged outside communication during certain phases of the process. I asked what process. She said it was complicated to explain. I asked to speak to Marcus again. She said she'd pass along the message. That was the last time Sienna answered my calls. The night of the text, I'd been awake anyway. Old habit from marshal years. I heard the notification at 1:47 and was out of bed before the screen fully lit. The pin he'd dropped put him at the Clearwater property, which I already had memorized. I dressed in 60 seconds, grabbed my phone, my old service weapon, and the small recording device I keep in my truck's center console, out of professional habit. I was on the highway before 2 in the morning. Montana in February is not a state that forgives impatience. The roads between Billings and the Clearwater property were clear but dark and winding, climbing into the foothills through stretches where my headlights were the only light in any direction. I drove fast but controlled. 22 years of training doesn't leave your hands even when the rest of you is terrified. The gate was a heavy iron thing set between 2 stone pillars with an intercom panel. I pressed the button, and a woman answered almost immediately. Too quickly for 2. 30 inches the morning. Someone had been watching. I told her I was there for my son. She said there was no one by that name at the facility. I told her I had his GPS location. She said the signal must be incorrect. I told her to open the gate. She said the facility was closed to outside visitors and that I should return during business hours. Then she said it, calm and final and utterly certain. Your son is exactly where he needs to be, and he's not going anywhere. I drove my truck through the gate. The lock gave on the second push. I'll deal with the property damage question another time. The main building sat at the end of a gravel drive lined with solar lanterns. Timber frame, 2 stories, built to look warm and welcoming. A man appeared on the porch before I'd finished parking. Big, maybe 40, wearing a fleece jacket with the Clearwater logo on the chest. He told me I was trespassing. I told him to get out of my way. He put his hand on my arm. I removed it. I'm 63 and I have a bad knee from an arrest gone wrong in 2009, but there are certain things the body remembers. I found Marcus in a cabin 60 yards behind the main building. His door was locked from the outside with a sliding bolt, the kind that requires no key, the kind that's specifically designed so that whoever is inside cannot get out. I slid the bolt, pushed the door open. He was sitting on the edge of a cot in the dark, fully dressed, backpack beside him like he'd been waiting. When he looked up and saw me, something in his face broke open that I hadn't realized had been closed. Dad, come on, we're leaving right now. He stood, and for a moment I thought he was going to hug me. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and moved toward the door, and I saw his hands shaking. Outside, voices. The man from the porch, and a woman I hadn't seen before. And then Gerald Voss himself, walking down from the main building in a heavy coat, unhurried, like a man who was entirely accustomed to being the most powerful person in any situation. Gerald was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of calm that comes from decades of telling people what to think. He looked at me the way people look at a minor inconvenience. "Robert," he said, "I think we should talk about this calmly." "We'll talk from my truck," I said. "Marcus, walk." Marcus is in the middle of a very important phase of his work here. Interrupting it now could be genuinely harmful. He's not in a phase of anything. He's my son, and he's coming home. Marcus stopped walking. I looked at him. Something was wrong. Not physically, he wasn't drugged, wasn't injured, as far as I could tell. But he was hesitating in a way that made my stomach drop. He was looking at Gerald, not at me. "Your father is reacting from fear," Gerald said gently. "That's understandable. But Marcus, you know what we've been working on. You know what it means to be interrupted now." "Marcus," I said quietly, "look at me." He looked at me, and I saw it then. Not the son Gerald was trying to talk to. My son, the one Claire had given me. The one who used to fall asleep in the truck on long drives and wake up already talking, picking up conversations mid-sentence like no time had passed. "Let's go," he said. And he walked. Gerald didn't move to stop us physically. He stood in the gravel drive and watched us with an expression I've spent a lot of time thinking about since then. Not angry, not panicked, calculating. "We're not done," he said as I started the truck. I believed him. The drive down from the property took 20 minutes. Marcus didn't speak for the first 10. I kept my hand on his shoulder the way I had when he was small and had bad dreams. When he finally started talking, the words came out uneven and halting, like a man working feeling back into a numb limb. They'd told him the first week that his outside communication was being limited for his own benefit, to help him be fully present. He'd believed them. By the second week, his phone had been taken for safekeeping during group sessions and simply never returned. When he asked for it, he was told he wasn't ready. When he pushed back, Gerald had a private conversation with him about resistance and what it indicated about unresolved attachment patterns. Marcus was smart enough to recognize manipulation, but he'd also been sleep-deprived, put on a restricted diet framed as a cleanse, and surrounded around the clock by people who all said the same things in the same calm tone. He'd started to doubt his own perceptions. He'd gotten the text out on a backup phone he'd hidden in his backpack from the first day, just in case. Something in him had known. "What happened to your phone?" I asked. "Sienna took it," he said. "She said she'd keep it safe." "Has Sienna been there the whole time?" He was quiet for a moment. "She's different there," he said, "like she's a different person. She told me her father was going to help me work through my grief about Mom, that it would fix things between us." I wanted to believe her. "I know," I said. I know you did. I took him to a hotel in Billings, ordered food, watched him eat like someone who hadn't been hungry in weeks. While he slept, I sat in the chair by the window and made 3 phone calls. The first was to my former partner in the Marshal Service, now a supervising agent with the FBI field office in Helena. The second was to a researcher I'd used on cases for years, a woman named Patricia who could find the financial skeleton of any organization inside 48 hours. The third was to a number I hadn't called in 2 years, a journalist named Dean Whitmore who covered institutional abuse for a national publication and who owed me a significant favor. By the time Marcus woke up, I had the beginnings of something. Patricia called back first. The Clearwater Renewal Center was registered as a non-profit wellness organization with a subsidiary LLC that held the physical property. Standard structure, but the non-profit filed for tax-exempt status on the basis of charitable services. And the charitable services included a residential care component for individuals experiencing mental health crises. That language mattered. It meant Clearwater could involuntarily hold people under certain conditions. It also meant they billed insurance companies and Medicare, and in 2 cases, Patricia had found so far, they'd billed for services to individuals who, according to family members, had never set foot on the property. That was fraud. Federal fraud. The kind that brought the FBI to the table without anyone having to ask twice. But it got worse. Dean called me that afternoon with something he'd been sitting on for 6 months. 3 families had contacted him independently about Clearwater. A woman in Oregon whose brother had entered the program voluntarily and been held for 4 months while his family tried every legal avenue to get him out. A man in Idaho whose wife had gone to Clearwater with Sienna as a personal referral and came out 18 months later, a different person, isolated from her previous relationships, signing over her savings to the Voss family's financial management company. And a retired teacher from Wyoming whose son had died on the Clearwater property, ruled accidental. Exposure during an unsupervised wilderness walk in November. The family had always believed he'd been left outside deliberately. He'd tried to leave 2 weeks before his death. Gerald had told the family he was in a critical phase and couldn't be released without medical risk. The teacher's name was Harold Mercer. He was 71 years old. He'd spent the 3 years since his son's death writing letters to every regulatory body he could identify and getting nowhere. I drove to meet him. Harold lived in a small house outside Cody with 2 dogs and a vegetable garden that had gone to seed for the winter. He made coffee without asking if I wanted any, and set it in front of me with the particular hospitality of a man who doesn't get many visitors. When I told him what I'd found, what had happened to Marcus, what Patricia and Dean had uncovered, he sat very still for a long time. Then he said, "I've been trying to tell people for 3 years." "I know," I said. "I'm listening." What Harold had wasn't evidence. It was something more important. He was the only person who'd gotten a former Clearwater staff member to talk. A young woman, a counselor who'd worked there for 8 months and left abruptly, had met Harold at a grief support group 18 months earlier. She told him things she said she'd never told anyone. About guests whose medications were switched without their knowledge. About documents patients signed during disorientation phases that they didn't understand. About Gerald's private conversations with wealthy families in which he offered what he called extended integration programs, indefinite residential holds, framed as therapeutic necessity in exchange for access to the Estaby, patients' financial accounts. The counselor's name was Amy. She'd signed an NDA when she left Clearwater. Harold had her contact information, but hadn't been able to get her to go on record. "I need to talk to her," I said. "She's scared," Harold said. "She has a daughter." Gerald made it clear what happened to people who talked. "What does that mean? What happened to people?" Harold looked at his coffee cup. "The teacher who died. He wasn't the only one. There were 2 others in the past 4 years. Both had tried to leave. Both died in circumstances that were ruled accidental or self-inflicted. Both investigations were handled by the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. I already knew what that likely meant. I asked Harold if he knew the sheriff's name. "Dale Voss," he said. "Gerald's younger brother." I sat with that for a moment. Then I called my contact at the FBI field office and told him everything. He was quiet for longer than I expected. Then he said, "Robert, this is bigger than I thought. We've had Clearwater on a list for 2 years. We couldn't get traction because the local jurisdiction kept closing doors. If you can get Amy to talk, And if we can establish the Medicare fraud, we can go federal. Federal jurisdiction means Dale Voss has no authority. But I need wire fraud or kidnapping across state lines to anchor it. The Idaho woman, I said. She crossed state lines to get there. Her husband would need to make a formal statement. I'll get it, I said. I drove back to Billings. Marcus was awake, sitting at the small desk in the hotel room with his laptop open, doing something I hadn't asked him to do. He'd been writing down everything he could remember. Dates, names, conversations, specific phrases Gerald had used. He handed me 14 pages. I looked at him. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. I wanted to. I sat across from him. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. What happened to you was not a failure of judgment. These people are professionals. They've been doing this for years. They know exactly how to make intelligent, healthy people doubt themselves. You didn't walk into a trap because you were naive. You walked into it because you loved Sienna and you trusted what she told you. That's not a flaw. That's who you are. He looked out the window for a moment. She knew, he said. Sienna knew what her father was doing. I think she's been raised inside it, I said. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. It doesn't make it better, he said quietly. Over the next 10 days, I worked alongside FBI agents and Dean Whitmore in a way that required careful coordination. We needed Gerald to keep operating, keep believing he was untouchable, while we built the case around him. Patricia found the financial connections, 3 shell companies. Payments to Dale Voss over 6 years totaling more than $200,000, and a payment structure to a state licensing board member that looked unmistakably like a bribe. Amy agreed to speak to federal investigators after I drove to meet her in person and spent 3 hours at her kitchen table. She was frightened, and she had good reasons to be frightened, but she was also carrying something that had been crushing her for 2 years. When she finally started talking, she talked for 4 hours. The agents recorded everything. The piece we still needed was the one that would give the FBI clear federal jurisdiction. The kidnapping charge required demonstrating that victims had been moved across state lines against their will as part of a coordinated scheme. We had the Idaho case, but the husband had become reluctant. We needed something cleaner, something current. The FBI supervisor, a woman named Agent Carla Torres, laid it out for me over the phone. She was careful and direct, the kind of agent who doesn't waste words. We need them to do it again, she said. In real time, with surveillance and wire. If Gerald extends an unsanctioned hold to someone who entered from out of state, and we can document the coercion, that's our anchor. Everything else stacks on top of it. I already knew where this was going. I'd known since she started talking. No, I said. Robert, he's been through enough. I understand that. But Marcus came out of there. He knows the rhythms, the language, how Gerald thinks. If he makes contact with Sienna, expresses a desire to return, and Gerald moves to hold him against his will. I said no. She waited. I'm not using my son as bait, I said. Find another way. I hung up and sat alone in the hotel room for a long time. Through the window, I could see the parking lot, a gray February sky, a gas station across the highway with its lights buzzing. I thought about Claire, about the last conversation we had that was a real conversation, before the illness made things difficult. She'd told me that Marcus was going to need me to trust him someday, that my instinct to protect would eventually become the thing he needed protection from. At the time, I'd understood it intellectually. Sitting in that hotel room, I understood it in my chest. I went and knocked on Marcus's door. He listened to everything I told him. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he sat for a moment and then said, I want to do it. Marcus, Dad, listen, I know what you're going to say, and I know you're scared, but I was in there. I know how Gerald talks. I know his patterns. I know what he'll believe and what he won't. And if he gets away with this, he's going to do it to someone else. Probably a lot of someone else's. He's been doing it for years because nobody with the right position and the right information has ever been able to stop him. That's what the FBI is for. The FBI needs me to do this, and you know it. He met my eyes. You didn't raise me to walk away from something just because it was hard. He sounded like his mother. Not just the words, something in the way he held himself when he said it. I looked at my son, 29 years old, steady and clear-eyed after everything he'd been through, and I understood that the moment had arrived that Claire had described, The moment when trusting him was the only real form of protection I had left to offer. I called Torres back. "I have conditions," I said. She agreed to all of them. Marcus sent Sienna a message the next morning. He told her he'd made a mistake leaving, that he'd been processing what Gerald had told him and he thought he wasn't finished with his work there, that he wanted to come back and do it right. He said it in the language of clear water, the phrases Amy had given us, the specific vocabulary that signaled a compliant participant. Sienna responded within an hour. She was warm, welcoming, certain. She said Gerald would be pleased. She said there was a room ready. The FBI positioned surveillance teams on the road to Clearwater and inside 2 vehicles in the facility's parking area with cover identities. Marcus would be wired. A panic signal was agreed upon. Torres personally briefed every agent on the timeline and the threshold for moving in. She looked me in the eye and told me nothing would happen to my son. I looked back at her and told her I intended to hold her to that. I drove Marcus to within a mile of the property. We sat in the truck for a few minutes without talking. Then he said, "I'll be fine." "I know," I said. "That doesn't make this easier." He nodded. "It's not supposed to be easy." I watched him drive the last mile in a borrowed vehicle. Then I pulled over on the shoulder and waited. The waiting was the worst thing I've experienced since the hospital room 8 years ago. Torres kept me updated every 20 minutes. Marcus arrived, was welcomed, was shown to a cabin. Gerald met with him privately. The conversation was being recorded. Gerald's tone was exactly as Amy had described in sessions with those he considered ready to be fully committed, calm, warm, but underneath it a pressure, a closing of options, a gentle restructuring of reality. He told Marcus that leaving had been a symptom, that returning was the first real step. He told Marcus that outside communication during this next phase would need to be suspended. He said it so smoothly that without context it almost sounded reasonable. Then he said, "And we'll need to hold your vehicle, just during the integration period. Standard procedure for full participants." Torres's voice in my earpiece. "That's the move. He's establishing involuntary hold. We're going." The vehicles moved. I drove to the gate. I don't need to reconstruct everything that happened inside in the next 40 minutes. What I need you to understand is that Gerald Voss, when the FBI came through the door of that main building, did not look afraid. He looked at the agents with the same mild disappointment he'd shown me at the gate 2 weeks earlier, as if this was simply another form of resistance he would need to address, as if the rules that applied to other people were a matter of perspective. Torres read him his rights in a voice with no particular inflection. She'd done it thousands of times. I found Marcus outside, being walked to an agent's vehicle by a young woman from the surveillance team. He was shaken, not hurt, but the reality of having been inside that compound again, even briefly, had left marks. He let me put an arm around him and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said he was already doing it again, already rewriting things. Even knowing what I knew, I could feel it starting to work. "I know," I said. "That's what makes him dangerous. That's what makes stopping him matter." The investigation took 11 months. The trial was covered nationally. Amy testified for 2 full days. The Idaho husband eventually came forward. 14 other former residents or their families submitted statements. Patricia's financial records showed 47 years of systematic fraud across 3 states, Medicare billing for non-existent services, and a money laundering structure that had been operating almost since the center's founding. Gerald Voss received 38 years. He would be over 100 years old before he was eligible for parole. His attorney argued the sentencing was excessive. The judge noted the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals, the documented deaths, and the systematic corruption of local law enforcement, and reminded the courtroom that federal guidelines existed precisely for cases where local protection had failed. Dale Voss, the sheriff, took a plea. 15 years. The state licensing board member who had received payments resigned and received 12 years in a separate proceeding. 3 other Clearwater staff members received sentences ranging from 4 to 9 years depending on their level of involvement. Sienna was not charged. Her role had been that of a true believer, not an architect. She entered a deprogramming program in California 6 months after the trial. Marcus told me about it in a brief, careful way that made clear it was not a subject he wanted to pursue. I respected that. The Clearwater property was seized. An organization that works with survivors of coercive control programs reached an agreement with federal authorities to use the facilities as a residential recovery center, a real one for people rebuilding after similar experiences. Harold Mercer attended the reopening. He stood by the window of the main building for a long time, not saying anything. Then he said, "My son would have liked this." I think I agreed with him. Marcus started a nonprofit 2 months after the verdicts. It focuses on providing legal and psychological resources to families trying to recover loved ones from coercive organizations. He called me before he filed the paperwork to tell me the name. He named it after his mother. I had to put the phone down for a minute when he told me. In November, a letter arrived at my home address, forwarded from the prison through official channels, which meant it had been read and approved. Gerald's handwriting, neat and even. He wrote that I had interfered in something I didn't understand, that the work he'd been doing was genuine and that the legal system had been manipulated by people with agendas, that what I had called a crime, history would evaluate differently. He closed by expressing what he called concern for my son's long-term well-being, given that he'd now chosen to make his trauma a public identity. I photographed both sides of the letter, sent copies to Torres and to Marcus's attorney for the file. Then I wrote a single line on a note card and mailed it back through the official channel. I have his mother's name on a building. What do you have? I'm 63 years old. My knee has never fully recovered, and there are mornings when getting out of bed is a project. I don't sleep as late as I should, and I work more than I probably need to. Some things don't change, but there are other things that have. I understand now that protection is not a wall you build around someone. It's a capacity you help them develop. It's teaching your child to fight, and then trusting that the teaching took. Claire understood that before I did. Marcus understood it before I did. I got there eventually. There are more places like Clearwater, more people like Gerald Voss, whose real skill is making exploitation look like care. They count on the fact that families don't know where to look, that local authorities can be managed, that the language of healing is difficult to challenge without seeming like you're against healing itself. They are very good at what they do, but they're not invisible. They leave traces. Financial records, former employees who couldn't live with what they'd seen, families who kept making noise even when no one was listening. To every parent, every sibling, every adult child who has ever felt that pull in your gut that something was wrong and talked yourself out of it, trust it. Make the call. Drive through the gate. Your instincts are not paranoia. Your love is not interference. And if someone tells you that your child, your brother, your parent is exactly where they need to be and they're not going anywhere, understand that this is not a statement about wellness. It's a warning. Treat it like one. Marcus still calls me every 2 days. Not because I asked him to. He just does. Sometimes we talk for an hour. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, just to check in, just to confirm we're both still here. Every time I see his name on my screen, I think of that text at 1:47 inches the morning, and I think of how close I came to losing him to something I can't fully articulate, something that doesn't look like danger until you're standing in the middle of it. I made a promise to his mother, and I kept it. But the truth is, it wasn't just me. Marcus kept it too. He walked out of that place both times on his own legs, and the second time he walked back in to help us shut it down. That's not my doing. That's who he is. I'd like to take credit for it. Mostly I'm just grateful he's mine.